Hi, this is Sandy, and I'd like to welcome you back to the second module in this series, and I'm going to present to you what can one ordinary person do. That's what we're going to discuss today. So if you have the PDF printed out, follow along with the PDF. So do you see the world getting further and further away from biblical principles and sin getting worse and worse? Do you see that happening? I do. I see it happening in our world. But what can we do? We say, what can we do? What can we do about it? What can I, as one person, do? Well, one person can't do anything to change the world, right? We need more than one. We need a whole group of people to change the world. Well, the Bible says if God is with us, what can be against us? This is in Romans 8:31. So if God is for you, nothing can be against you. So why can't you change the world as one person? So there are many biblical examples of ordinary people who've done extraordinary things because God anointed them. They were not perfect at all, but God used them. They were murderers, like Moses. He was a murderer, okay? Adulterers like David, sex offenders like Joseph. Most of us don't even think about this, but if Joseph were alive today, he'd be on the sex offender registry because he was accused of a sex offense. And orphans, like Esther, she was an orphan, and God used her in a great and mighty way. They were weak, they had issues, just like we have, and they trembled under the task given them, but they did it. They did it because God called them. So how does God work through his people? This brings me back to the church that said, come to us and see how God fits into your life. So you're going to ask the creator of the universe to fit into your pathetic life. Okay, this is not how it works. You need to ask, how do you fit into his plans? He has a plan for you. How do you fit into it? Another great quote from one of the modern day preachers that I've heard is, we do what we can do and God will do what we can't do. So you start your pathetic plan, and when you get stuck, God's going to come along and help you out. So are you in God's will in either one of these scenarios? No, you're in your own will. You're not in God's will. And who's in control of this? You are, when you need to let him be in control. When it's his plan, he's in control. He's doing the calling. He's doing the directing. And he's the one that gets the results, not you. We must have an attitude of servanthood. There again, we go back to being a servant. So when God spoke, three things happened. Number one, they know when God spoke to them. When you see a burning bush and God is speaking out of it, you know that he's speaking. When someone knocks you off your horse, blinds you, and speaks to you on the road, you know that God is speaking. So you will know that God is speaking to you. They knew what God was saying. So there was no doubt about what he was saying. They knew what they were to do in response. So they knew what to do. To see real change in the world, we need to get back to biblical principles. And I hear this all the time. Well, we're in the end times. God's not going to do anything right now. We're in the end times. We're in the great falling away. Well, we probably are. I probably agree with you that we are. But that doesn't mean that God does not want to revive the hearts of his people. He does. He's with us until the end of the age. Not until almost the end of the age. And he always wants to see revival. So we need to remember that. And all the good feeling preaching in the world isn't going to bring about the change. People like Zig Ziglar, they're not going to bring about that kind of a change. Only Jesus and his submitted servants will bring about the kind of change that we need. So let's get into some of the people. Let's talk about Moses first. Okay, there's a picture of Moses. Well, no, that's actually a picture of Charlton Heston because I had a hard time finding pictures of Moses. It didn't look like Charlton Heston. I think Charlton Heston was a great-looking Moses, so we're going to go with that. The story of Moses begins in Exodus 2. And God had his hand on Moses from the very beginning of his life. From the time he was a baby, God had his hands on Moses. Moses was born at the time Pharaoh was having all the male children killed. So this is not a good time to be born a male if you were an Israelite. Moses' mother hid him for 3 months, but she couldn't hide him anymore because I guess he was getting too big. So what she did was she made an ark. And she sent his sister Miriam to put Moses into the Nile River in the ark. Well, what happened was one of the daughters of Pharaoh came to bathe in the river and saw the ark. Well, she probably felt sorry for the baby, so she took him back and raised him in the house of Pharaoh. This act did 3 things. Number 1, it saved Moses, right, because he would have died if it wasn't for that act. And it really put one over on Pharaoh because at this time he was having all of the male babies in Israel killed. And so he's now raising one and paying for one guy that he wanted to kill. And it gave Moses knowledge of the people that he would be dealing with in the future. He needed that knowledge, and he got it by being there in the castle with all of them. So even before God called Moses, he had a heart for his people. He knew he was an Israelite, and he had a heart for his people. So when he was 40 years old, he went out to see what was going on with his brethren, to see what was happening. Well, I guess he didn't like what was happening because he saw a slave master beating Hebrew slaves, so he killed the guy. This is what we do when we try to take things on ourselves. We do things that are completely out of the will of God, and we usually screw everything up because this was not God's plan. He screwed everything up. So Pharaoh wanted to kill him. So what did Moses have to do? He fled to Midian. He had to get away, go away. So he went away. He went to Midian, and he got married, and he became a humble shepherd. So he probably thought the only thing he was going to do for the rest of his life was raise a family and herd some sheep. But God had other plans. Along came this burning bush that wouldn't be burned up. So he'd been out there again for 40 years. He was 80 years old by this time. So he saw a bush that wouldn't be consumed. He went over to see what was happening with this bush, and God started speaking out of it. Well, this would kind of freak you out, wouldn't it? So God heard the cries of his people. He wanted to use Moses to deliver his people. Well, Moses immediately started arguing with God. How do you argue with God? Well, I do it all the time, but he did the same thing most of us do. And he said, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" This is in Exodus 3:11. So he said, "I don't want to do this. Who am I?" And he also said, "I'm not eloquent. I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue." So he really wasn't Charlton Heston after all, because Charlton Heston was never slow of speech or tongue. And I'm sure he didn't really want to go back to Egypt because he thought he might face death. The other Pharaoh wanted to kill him, so he thinks that, well, the new Pharaoh might want to kill him too, so he probably didn't want to go back. He returned to Egypt, and God used him in a mighty way, right? First off, he used him to free the people and give them all or most of the wealth that Egypt had, and to destroy Egypt's army, because when they crossed over the Red Sea, when the water came back, it destroyed Pharaoh and his army. And he led the people another 40 years through the desert. Now, this is probably a weird sight to people, seeing these band of Israelites wandering around all 40 years, because it was only a 2-week journey. And why did they have to wander around? Because they were disobedient. They didn't believe God. So all of those disbelievers had to die before they could go over the promised land. Moses established the nation of Israel, the laws that they were to abide by, the priesthood, and the tabernacle. The whole Jewish faith came through Moses. Okay, now let's get to Esther. I really like the story of Esther because she's a woman and I'm a woman. And she was used to deliver her people and to save them. This is from the movie One Night with the King. If you've never seen it, it's a great movie. You need to see that movie. And she was a woman of great courage. Esther and her people were in captivity at that time. Because they had been disobedient to God, they were in captivity. And the story begins at the castle of King Xerxes. And he had 1,400 of his closest friends over for a drunken brawl. For a 1 week drunk was what they were going on, okay? And he wanted Queen Vashti to appear before him so he could show off her beauty to all of his 1,400 drunken friends. Well, I'm sure she didn't want to go before them because she didn't want to be molested by a bunch of drunk guys. So she refused to come. The men didn't like this because they didn't want women to know that they could actually get by with this kind of thing. So King had her deposed. He got rid of her. This led a vacuum in the castle. They needed a new queen. So what did they do? Well, they called for all the young, beautiful virgins of the land to compete for the king's heart. Esther was one of the women chosen because she was very, very pretty. Now, she was an orphan, and her uncle Mordecai was known in the court. He was like the court stenographer. He wrote down everything that happened in the court. So he was known by the king. And each young virgin was taken to see the king to see if she pleased him. Now, this was after a whole year of doing beauty treatments and being taught how to be a queen. They finally go before the king. When it was Esther's turn, the king fell in love with her. It says that the king loved her more than all the other women, so he fell in love with her. Now, she was crowned the queen, and she was instructed by her uncle Mordecai not to speak of her background or tell the king that she was Jewish. So she kept her word and did not do that. Well, the plot thickens. The evil Haman comes into the picture here. Haman didn't like Mordecai because Mordecai would not bow down to him when he was elevated above all the princes. So Haman was like a prime minister, and he wanted all the other princes to bow down to him, and Mordecai wouldn't do it. Well, because of that, he wanted all the Jewish nation destroyed because he knew Mordecai was a Jew. So the king agreed to this. There were some shenanigans that went on, I'm sure, but the king agreed to this, and he sent out a decree that all the Jews were to be destroyed in one day. Now, once this decree went out, it couldn't be recanted. You couldn't go back on the decree. Once it went out, it stayed. Nothing you could do about it. But the king didn't know that his beloved Esther was a Jew. So Mordecai told Esther about the decree, and he pleaded with Esther to go before the king and ask her to save the Jewish nation. Now, she was reluctant to do this at first because she could be killed. If she wasn't invited to the court, the king didn't hold out his golden scepter, she would die. Immediately, she would die. And I'm sure she was thinking that, well, he had one queen deposed, and what she was doing was much worse than what Vashti did. So he could do it again. He could do the whole thing over again. But he had a love for Esther. He loved her. I don't think he would do it, but she was afraid. So what did she do? She decided to go before the king to save her people. And she asked the Jewish nation to fast for her for 3 days to give favor before God. So she did. Okay, she went before the king, and he held out the golden scepter and granted her request. Well, I'm sure she didn't want to tell everybody right there in front of all of the king's court that she was Jewish and what was going on. So she requested that King Xerxes and Haman join her for a banquet. So they both accepted her request. She actually had 2 banquets for the king and Haman. And by this time, Haman was all full of himself. I'm sure his chest was all popped out. Oh, I'm eating with the king and the queen. I'm really, really great. Everything I want is going to happen. Well, he built a gallows for Mordecai to be hanged on, a really tall gallows. And the king was very interested in Esther's request. So he asked, what do you want, Esther? So she revealed that all the Jewish people were going to be killed because of Haman's plot, and that she was Jewish, and to order the deaths of her people. So the king was very angry about this. And so what did he do? Well, he ordered Haman to be hung on his own gallows. Now, he was especially upset after he found Haman trying to sexually assault his wife. So that's just what you do when you're in trouble. You go assault the king's wife, right? So the edict had already gone out to have all the Jews killed, and he couldn't go back on it. So he ordered the Jews to be armed so they would defend themselves. And so what happened during this time, during this day? Well, the Jews overwhelmed those who hated them and destroyed them. So not only did the edict go out, but they were able to destroy their enemies because of this. So even in captivity, the Lord was with them. Mordecai became the second in command beside the king. So he became the new Haman. He was now the prime minister. And the Feast of Purim, which was established because of Esther's courage, and the Jews still celebrate that today. And here's another picture of Queen Esther. So Esther was a woman of great courage, and she was called to save her people. So let's talk a little bit about Paul. Here's a picture of Paul. I think we don't really know. So there weren't any pictures back then, but Paul was an apostle. Okay, we first meet the apostle Paul in Acts when he's going about happily persecuting Christians, right? He's killing them all because they're the people of the way. Now, he was highly educated in the law, and he knew they weren't following the law. So he says, I'm going to get rid of all of these people. Wipe this out. Well, what happened to him? Well, the Lord messes his plans by knocking him off his horse and striking him blind on the way to Damascus when he was going to persecute more Christians. And wouldn't that have been a shock? Just like seeing a burning bush, getting knocked off your horse and struck blind and God speaking to you, that would have been a real shock. Paul found out that he was persecuting the God of the universe and that this God wasn't very happy about it. So God changed Paul over to his side because he was tired of him killing his people. So he turned him over to his side. Paul got the call to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So the Jews didn't trust him anymore. He was a bold and passionate man, okay? In his time, he was beaten. He was stoned and left for dead. He was imprisoned. He was shipwrecked. He was hungry. All kinds of things, but he was very passionate about what he did. And he traveled the world, as they knew it at that time, and took the gospel all over Europe. If it wasn't for Paul, the Gentiles would have never had the gospel. Let's come forward a little bit into modern times and let's talk about the Reverend Billy Graham. And there's a picture of him in his younger years. We've studied all the characters in the Bible, so let's say, does this still work today? Well, we don't have to look any further than Billy Graham to find this out. Most of us, if we're not really, really young, we remember who Billy Graham was. He just celebrated his 95th birthday in 2013, November of 2013. So he has a lot of longevity and he has respect because he followed his calling to preach the gospel to the whole world. So young Billy didn't even want to be an evangelist. That was the last thing he wanted to be. He wanted to play baseball. He was a great baseball player and that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to play baseball. But when he was 16, an employee of his father's asked him to revival. He was led by the Mordecai Ham. I'm having so much trouble saying that word. It was during that time he felt Ham was speaking to him specifically, and he gave his life to Christ during that revival. Now, he didn't receive his call then. He didn't receive his call to evangelize until he was 18 years old. He was on the 18th green of the Temple Terrace Golf Course and Country Club in Florida, and he heard a call to go preach the gospel. Now, this is what has happened to Reverend Graham. Let me give you a little insight into what was going on when he was young and when he was first called to preach. During the late 1800s, early 1900s, we had come out of a decade of peace after the Revolutionary War, and then we got into the war between the states. Things were peaceful for a little while. And people thought, well, we're coming into a peaceful time. We're coming into Nirvana, the age of Aquarius, whatever they called it back then. But things were crushed very quickly because what happened? World War I happened. And then we had a time of peace and prosperity during the 20s. And then we had the Depression. And then World War II happened. And people were very discouraged at the time, especially after what they saw coming out of the prison camps, the Jews, and all the death camps in Germany. They were very discouraged, so much so that Reverend Graham's mentor actually quit the ministry because he was so discouraged. And I think Reverend Graham was called at that time to bring the people back, to show that God did love them and to bring the people back to him and to keep peace because the world was going to fall apart if that didn't happen. So he conducted over 400 crusades in 185 countries and in 6 continents. He was all over the place, which is what you have to be if you're an evangelist. His audience had reached more than 2.2 million people at the time. He's been a spiritual advisor to every president since Dwight David Eisenhower, even President Obama. Okay, that's just a picture. Don't freak out about it. Graham has been on the Gallup's list of the most admired men and women 55 times since 1955. He was on it 49 consecutive times, more than any other individual in the world. So this is what Wikipedia said about him. Graham was called the Great Legitimator in the 1960s. His presence confirmed sanctity on an event, authority on a president, acceptability on wars, desirability on decency, and shame on indecency. So see what serving God, where it can get you, can give you all the power of the universe if you just follow him. This is a picture of Reverend Graham in his later years. In 1970s, he was named America's pastor. When he was asked what he wanted to ask the Lord when he got to heaven, he says, I want to ask him, why me? Because I was a much better farmer than I was a preacher. So he's always humble. This was quite a career for a teenager from South Carolina. So in conclusion, how does this apply to you? Well, you may not be called to save your people or to preach the gospel to the world, but you are called to do something for the Lord. If you're a Christian, you are called to do something. God is always at work around you. So where is he working? Find that and plug into it. And do you know what you're called to do? Do you know what you are anointed to do? Those are the 2 things that you need to know. And are you willing to make the changes and sacrifices in order to accomplish his plan for your life? One of the first things that's going to happen if you get called is you're going to have a crisis of faith. So every time God called someone, it was followed by a crisis of faith. Moses argued with God, right? He didn't want to go back to Egypt. He was afraid he might get killed. He was slow of speech. He didn't want to go back. Esther didn't want to go before the king because, there again, she might get killed. So she didn't want to go before the king. Paul was rejected by the Jews because they didn't trust him. He tried for 3 or 4 years to go preach to them, but they didn't trust him, so he was rejected by the Jews. Billy Graham almost gave up because he was such a bad preacher, so he had to practice over and over and over and over again in order to become a better preacher. When faced with this crisis of faith, do you give up? Do you know what to do? Changes have to be made, okay? Moses had to leave his wife and go back to Egypt. So he had to leave his wife and his family and go back to Egypt. Esther had other plans for her life when she was called. She may have been in love with someone else. I'm sure she thought that she might spend the rest of her life in a harem, so she probably didn't want to do this, but she was called by God to do it. Paul was going about persecuting the people of the way because they were heretics. He had to completely change his mind because he was persecuting Christians, and he had to completely change. Billy Graham was wanting to play baseball and take over his dad's dairy farm. He did not want to be an evangelist, but the call changed his life. Are you going to be disobedient and ignore God's call because you don't want to change? Maybe you don't want to change, but you're going to have to. Okay. So what can one ordinary person do? When God calls you, there isn't anything you can't do. Remember what Billy Graham, he was a great legitimator. He was America's pastor. So all of the power of the universe comes down to you. God gives it out to you when you need it. But you got to be an obedient servant. Here we go back to servanthood again. You got to be obedient and serve with the inspiration of God, and you can do anything for the Lord. So this is the end of this one. Join me next time in the next module on who is the center of your life.